And good morning, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is a guest making their official debut on the show. And I'm so excited to have him because he is a fellow Audiomaze author. Now, my guest today discovered his love for the written word while in high school and has been writing ever since. His latest novel, West of Apocalypse, is now available from Time Killer Publishing. His short stories have been published in many fantasy anthologies and various zines, or ezines, I should say. Like the father figure in his Gidion Keep vampire hunter novels, he works as a 911 dispatcher for Henrico County Police and has done so for more than 2 decades. He served as the 2013 chair for James Rivers Writers, which produces one of the nation's best annual conferences for educating and connecting writers. He graduated from the University of South Carolina with a degree in broadcast journalism in 1995. And in the years that followed, he worked as a TV news producer, first in Columbus, Georgia, and then in Richmond, Virginia, where he and his family have made their home. And without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, fellow author and fellow Audiomaze creator, Mr. Bill Blume. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for letting me do this. I'm excited.
Awesome, Bill. Awesome. I'm so excited to have you here. And as our viewers are going to see, like, you have quite the book collection, I must say. And I can see some of your novels are right behind you. So before we dive deep into your background as an author, would you like to share with the viewers and listeners your Vampire Hunter series?
Yeah, Gideon's a very popular piece of my writing. It was the first thing I got published. And in fact, the first book, Gideon's Son, originally was released with a different title called Tales of a 10th Grade Vampire Hunter. The publisher decided it might be better to change the title, so we went with Gideon's Son. And as a matter of branding, the idea being each of the stories would start with Gideon's name. And so we did Gideon's Son followed by Gideon's Blood.
Right.
Tales of a 10th Grade Vampire Hunter was a little bit of whimsy. Making fun of my last name, Blume, L-U-M-E, matching up with Judy Blume, who had Tales of a 4th Grade Nothing.
Right.
The big joke was that the second book's title would end up being "Are You There, Vampires? It's Me, Gideon." And if you know Judy Blume's books, you'll get the joke.
Oh yes. Oh man, that's actually pretty awesome. And honestly, I'm not gonna lie. Members of a 10th Grade Vampire Hunter, it has some kind of whimsy to it. Like, it's going to be like some dark humor, which I absolutely love. So before we dive deep into that, let's learn a little bit more about you, Bill. So from your bio, you've done quite a lot. You've written numerous stories, short stories, ezines. You've worked in broadcasting, 911 dispatcher. You've done it all. So how did this sort of passion for writing come about in a sea of, so many opportunities?
For me, the biggest thing that got me interested in writing was comic books. As soon as I started collecting back when I was in middle school, I was automatically kind of coming up with my own characters and stories. And I had like a spiral notebooks that would have characters that I had drawn. My son actually unearthed them just the other evening. It was over at the apartment with me and my wife, and he was pulling it out and it's like, oh God. I mean, it was really kind of neat. And then, truthfully, that stuff did eventually end up producing novels, but that was part of the thing. So yeah, I wanted to write comic books originally. That was the real passion. And it was in the process of meeting people within the comic book industry that I ended up trying to write a novel instead.
Ah, okay.
The comic book authors I met told me this horrific story about how a comic book he had created with this artist, he lost control of it. The publisher ended up taking control of the characters, and the artist had all the control, and he no longer was writing it.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and I was like, oh well, I don't want that to happen. And so I had the idea, well, what if I did it as a novel? Like, it's just me then.
Right.
That was a blessing and also a real challenge because up to that point, I was a terrible reader as far as
Okay.
books. Yes, let me tell you, I've come to appreciate that I did learn a lot as a writer from the comic books I read, and so that did help. There's a lot to learn from them, and people shouldn't discount them.
No.
Pacing, character development, dialogue. Dialogue is so important in comic books, and if you're doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things that I took a lot of that and was able to take it over into my experience as an author for novels. There was a lot I still had to learn to make up for the places where I was lacking, but that's what got me started. And even one of my most recent books, The Dragon Spy, that actually was born out of the comic book ideas I had back as a teenager.
Okay, all right. Now, what would you consider your aha moment when you realized you wanted to take your passion for writing and creating and build your brand as an author and creator?
As far as building the brand, I don't think it really started coming together until Gidion.
Mm,
Gideon, I think, is where my voice really locked in. It wasn't, although humorously enough, there is a novel I recently released. And I released it a few years ago, serialized. This book, The Cold Shoulder. It's the most legitimately epic fantasy book I've ever done
all right.
in terms of the reality and all that stuff. It was where my voice was starting to come together. And it's funny if you going back and looking at it now, there are little places in all the books I've done since then that often nod back to that book. And so it was funny that it got released after a lot of the other stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I went back and polished it up a little bit and made some very necessary changes to some of the things that I no longer believe politically. Some of that stuff did not age well, and I was not happy with past Bill.
All right.
Uh,
Okay.
and I was able to fix most of it. There were things where I did have to kind of like, all right, for the sake of the story, the sake of the reality, I'm going to have to hold on to that. But yeah, I was able to make enough changes to where I was comfortable releasing it. At least that's the main thing. But yeah, it was one of those things that when I wrote Gideon, that's where the voice really came together. I like to have a very tight third person fault setting. Tight third person to where it's almost like you're reading first person, but
Right.
it's the character telling the story. But with that in mind, I will do first person. And in fact, one of my favorite short story that I've ever written is first person present tense. And it was because the concept for it made it necessary. I was just like, as soon as I had the idea for what the story was going to be, and the story is called Bitter Bill. And that one was about an assassin in a steampunk Victorian era who goes to Hong Kong on a quest to find the pill of immortality and the price she pays for what she does.
Right.
The way that story was told, I was like, yeah, this has to be first person present tense or it will not work. And it was that was one of those other aha moments.
Right.
It was Gideon. And when I had that moment, that part of the reason that's one of my favorite short stories that I've ever done is because it was one of those moments where I knew my craft had leveled up because I was able to analyze the story I was going to tell, and I could go, oh, well, then I need to do this.
Okay. And kind of with that same topic in mind, let's talk about the construction of your books themselves and how you approach storytelling. So let's start with a little icebreaker question. So when you began writing the Vampire Hunter series, what were the goals you had going into this project as the author, as well as the promise making to your future readers? And the reason I bring this up, Bill, is that for some authors, the promise could be, I just want to tell, a good story. First and foremost, that's the main thing. Some people go a different route. They want to take them on a journey, have it be like an experience, make them have that nostalgia memory for some kind of feeling, whatever that may be. There is some promise, and sometimes there's no promise. But what about you, Bill? what is sort of your promise and sort of like your goals whenever you're writing one of your stories?
More often than not, I'm just wanting to write a story that's going to be fun and entertaining.
Mm.
Now, that said, my stories have also gotten a lot more overtly political in their nature as I've gotten older, and it's not because I'm looking to say something in that sense when I'm
Right.
crafting the story. Not most of the time. More often than not, it's just simply, and I know you can appreciate this as an author. If you're going to pour that much of yourself onto the page, there is
Yes.
no way the things that are important to you and in your life are not going to be in there too. And so
Hmm.
don't intend for there to be something political in the story you're writing. It's going to be there. There's no way.
Yes.
It's just the nature of the beast of creativity, which is part of the thing that makes it wonderful too.
Hmm.
So it's like I'm kind of in awe of the authors who can craft an amazing story with the intention of making a political statement and still make it incredibly entertaining. That's a talent I don't have.
Mm.
For me, it's always got to go the other way. With Gideon, the goal was very simple. I wanted to write the best damn vampire hunter novel anyone had ever seen. That was the goal, first and foremost. And
Absolutely. And just a little tangent on vampires. I noticed a big trend in sort of like, I don't want to say, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like overtly changing the lore of vampires, but definitely taking vampires into like new genres and exploring new themes. One case in point, I had an author last year, which I have to go back and finish reading the book, but it's a vampire who was a gladiator during the time of Rome. And he's just somehow existing in today's society. He is, he's a wanderer, he's a warrior, but he's not really a good guy. He's just an embodiment of nature that just exists. And I love that approach. Another book I found really interesting with the vampires is actually one from my good friend, Raven White, who wrote The Sentimental Dead, and how she approached vampires. It's almost like beings that are like pariahs. They are plagues. They are these very disease ridden, lower individuals that are just struggling in society. I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've read Sentinel Dead, but the idea of using vampires outside of the traditional norm is very fascinating to me, as well as any other creature in like what I call like the dark mythology, like werewolves, shapeshifters, and so forth. Now, the next question, Bill, is also another fun one. Is as authors, sometimes when we work on a project, we don't tell anybody we're working on, not even friends and family. But as I've had a lot of guests on the show said, even if they don't say anything, their friends and family are going to figure it out one way or another. So for you, when did you tell your friends and family that you were working on this series?
I don't really. I would say Sherry, my wife, is the one who I was always talking with. But she, as far as we were in a writer group together. My wife is a creative too. She is,
Mm.
and her creativity bleeds over to so many more aspects of her life than mine.
Right.
It's like she is an incredible cook, and it's because of her creative process. Likewise, she makes jewelry, and I've seen her,
Ah.
watched her make earrings within 15 minutes of us needing to leave the house to go with an outfit she's wearing, and it looked great. I mean, Sherry's brilliant when it comes to that. So yeah, oh yeah, just that creative process just fascinates me. For me though, as far as sharing it with anyone, no one read that book until it was done. I didn't have.
Mm.
Like Sherry and I were in a writers group for a little while where we called ourselves the 10-page club because every month we'd get together and we would exchange 10 single-spaced pages of what we'd been working on. There was a good upside to it in the sense that you could tell whether or not, at least at the start, the story was working. The downside was when you think about that, it's taking a long time for the reader to get through the story. And by the time you've gotten about 7 months or so into it, they have probably lost a lot of the threads.
Absolutely true.
As an actual reliable beta reader. By the time I did Gideon's Hunt, I was at the point where I recognized that we weren't even doing the 10-page group anymore. I actually broke up the band. I was bad.
Mm,
We're all friends. We still hang out all the time. We love each other. We all still live in Richmond, and we hang out all the time. But that wasn't something I showed anyone until it was done. And that was scary because until that point, I had no way to know if it was even working. I wrote it over the course of 2 summers. And when it was done, I got into the hands of some beta readers, and it was really cool to see it landed the way I wanted it to. That was a huge relief. But yeah, up until that point, I didn't let anyone see it. And that wasn't until I started it in, I think it was the summer of 2010
okay.
and summer of 2011. And the one of the things that kept me going and gave me faith in that book is it didn't get published until 2 years later in 2013. Part of what going was one of my beta readers made the comment, that book needs a home. And
Nice.
I have thanked her many times for that because it's tough. It can be lonely in the process, but you can't do it.
Yes. That is very true. That is very true, Bill. Writing is a very lonely experience, but you don't have to do it alone. You can sometimes need to have a team with you to help you figure out, why you embarked on this journey in the first place. And from that point, this leads to another set of reflective questions, which I like to ask. And they're kind of very similar to the questions I asked you on the previous podcast, Into the Maze. So, as authors, going back to the discussion of, writing is a very lonely process. And it is sometimes, it can take years to, write even the first draft before you even get editors, proofreaders, beta readers, all that taken care of. And then making the decision of, do I want to publish this to share it with friends? Or do I want to publish this and make money and build a career off of it, which we'll talk about when we get to the business side. But even at that point, with that mindset, we do have to understand, the digital age of the publishing industry, because it has changed in the last 20 years. It is ridiculous, especially independent publishing, which has just skyrocketed. And being an author, regardless if you're hybrid, indie, or traditional, you do find yourselves at this crossroad where if you publish something, it's both a benefit and a curse. Now, for the benefit side, you are able to meet other authors, connect with readers, your fans, and build your brand and platform to really let people know this is who you are as an author. On the other side, we do unfortunately leave ourselves exposed to a lot of hate speech, trolls, negativity, and a lot of stuff that can be very detrimental to an author's well-being and mental health. Now, a lot of my guests on the show have said that they have not had horrible experiences when it comes to trolls, but there have been instances where there have been some candid responses to their books or their characters, which again, we will touch on when we get to the business portion. And if you wrap all that up, that all leads to imposter syndrome, which is always there for us creatives. So, Bill, whenever you were working on a book in the Gidion series, did you have those moments of heightened anxiety and imposter syndrome? And what has disciplined you, looking back, what has disciplined you to continue writing not just the Gidion Vampire series, but also branching out into other genres for other stories, like, of course, right behind you, Dragon Spy and The Cold Shoulder?
Honestly, as far as the Gidion Keep books go, I will say I didn't worry so much about imposter syndrome with the first one because I wasn't even really published novel-wise at that point. I'd had a few short stories out there, but that was it. It wasn't until I had to sit down and write the second one where it was like, oh, God. That was scary. And everyone hears about the sophomore slump. And that was one of those things I was like, I really did not want that to happen. And so the journey for that second book was a little daunting at the start, But for me, it was one of those things. I'd already been kicking around, even though I wrote the first book to stand on its own, and it does. I had already been kicking out the idea of where the next 2 books were going to go. And I do the quotation marks next 2 books because it ended up being the next book. It ended up being a trilogy instead of a trilogy. And not for that. The publisher I was with, what my original concept for the second book, the way I was going to do it, they did not want to do. The reason stories to be told from one point of view, whereas I was going to do 2. You were going to have Gideon's point of view, and you're going to have the point of view of the vampire who was hunting him in that book. The idea being a reactionary story. Gideon has gotten his victory in the first book against the local coven of vampires. Vampires who exist along the East Coast notice something that's happened in Richmond. And so they're like, well, there's clearly a hunter there. We need to get him out. Because he's even taking out the guys who happen to go through there. So they hire this vampire who specializes in hunting vampire hunters. And a lot of the tension in the story was originally going to come from the fact that you would not know that while Gideon's going about his regular hunting experience, that there's this vampire coming for him. And so it was kind of like the idea of you have a person sitting at a table with a bomb underneath and in a movie, and it's like the camera tilts down for you to see the bomb and then tilts up.
Right.
Idea. That was the approach I was going to take.
Okay.
The publisher changed it to where I needed to only have Gideon's point of view. That's gone. I had to then go, all right, so how am I getting the knowledge to Gideon as quickly as possible for that to be at stake in the story? And God bless them for that. I'm so grateful because it was a much better book for it. I don't regret that at all. And having to face that struggle and figure it out, that probably was helpful in the sense that it distracted me from the fear of the sophomore slump. Because I sit down and be like, all right, how am I going to do this? What's going to be the approach? And I loved a lot of the places that second book went. It was fun to get the payoff that I had intended for almost all the characters.
Right.
Favorite action scenes with Gideon is in the second book. The fight where he first meets the vampire hunting him. Oh, man. That was one of the... Even before that, there's a fight between him and 2 vampires in a VW van. That, man, yeah, one of my beta was like, that was so good. I think Gideon was where the action scenes really started to amp up for me as a writer. But I mean, as far as the thing that keeps me going is I'm stubborn. Love that a quality my mother hated in me. You are stubborn just like your grandfather. I eventually realized it didn't skip a generation, by the way. But yeah, that's the stubbornness is what keeps me going. Because I don't quit. I won't do it. When I sit down to start a story, it is very rare for me to abandon it. I've already figured out what I want to try to do with it, and it can really kick my butt along the way. But I still get it done. I mean, my wife has called me a machine, and she's not far off on that. She's frustrated because she is stubborn too, and she's like, that doesn't help me the way it helps you.
Nope.
So, but yeah, it's one of those things that I write like I have a chip on my shoulder.
Okay.
Probably not healthy, but I do produce stories because of it. I need to write. I'm not happy when I'm not writing. And if I'm stuck in a story, I can become very difficult to be around at that point. Because I'm just frustrated trying to figure out why. Why is it not coming together? Why is this story stalled? Thankfully, it does not happen often for me.
Right. And, that is very, very true, Bill. That is very true. I've actually talked with a lot of authors that, have said the same thing, that they need to write. They absolutely need to have that passion to, write their stories. And this sort of leads into the next question, which I think I asked you before on the other show, but now I actually want to hear your thoughts regarding to Gideon and your stories in particular. And that question is the notion of a golden age right now. And the reason I mention this is that I've asked this question to a lot of guests on the show of whether or not in a golden age. And this all goes back to a previous guest of mine who mentioned on her social media that we are in a golden age that sort of stemmed from the COVID years, the lockdown years, because it pushed people out of their comfort zones to really, expand their interests or reclaim lost hobbies and passions. New artists, new musicians, new content creators, everything. And I myself was part of that group because I began writing back in 2020. Officially, that's when I started writing The Gathering and worked on Aminus, followed by Decimus, and then, well, actually, Decimus and then Michael, but Michael was published third, and I'm currently working on Decimus. But looking back on it, I do think of, even though I was part of it, does that really technically mean that it was like a golden age, even though I was a part of it? Because some have gone forward and said that we're not in a golden age or a renaissance, because while there is an influx of new authors, new stories out there, which is great, a majority of those may not exist in the sense of, they want to contribute to the craft of storytelling. They're just existing in the void. They just have a placement there, which is like, oh, I wrote a book. Here it is. Have at it. So for you, Bill, do you think that we are in a renaissance or golden age, or are we entering that period?
Gosh, I'm not totally sure what my answer would have been the last time around. I feel like in some ways, yes, but I will say I don't think so much for you and me. And I don't mean bad way.
Right.
The reason I say that is there are so many voices that get weeded out by the traditional publishing process. And I feel like a lot of diversity has finally gotten to be able to get out more easily into the public eye.
Right.
Through the way that now self-publishing has kind of increased in terms of the accessibility. That's so many things that gatekeep it. And even now, there's still some of that in there, but it's not as much as it used to be. And I think that's what's important, because in some ways, I think it's allowing those of us as readers to get to find new voices and new perspectives that we didn't have access to when we walked into a Barnes and Noble.
Yes.
And even now, that's still tough to do. When I was working with my cover artist for the cover to The Dragon Spy, I was frustrated because I thought, well, let me go to the bookstore and take a look at what's out there. And that was kind of his advice to a degree. Take a look at what's out there and see what you want to kind of cannibalize to craft what would be current and a good idea for how we want to make your cover to look. So much of the stuff out there on the shelves was old. At least by publishing standards. And I'm just like looking at it, I'm like, this is not helpful. And it was kind of frustrating and eye-opening to me, because it kind of drove home how stagnant the books on the shelves are in a store like that. Now indie bookstores are a different story, but even they have to kind of give way to the pressures of what their customers are going to want to read. And so, you still have shelf space. I'm fortunate that one of the local bookstores I work with, Fountain Bookstore, they have been on my side. The owner, Kelly Justice, they have really, really done a lot to help me through the years. In fact, when I did make the dive into indie publishing, that was one of the first people I talked to, Kelly Justice. And thank God for that. She was extremely helpful.
Nice.
So, in a golden age, I think in some ways, yeah. I think the biggest thing I'm worried about is if we're going to see some new gates being thrown up. And I wouldn't doubt in some cases it'll be well-intentioned, but it will have a potential negative effect. We'll see.
Yes. And speaking of negative effect, I think it is important to talk about the role of AI in the publishing world, which I'm sure you have definitely seen on social media, people talking about how a lot of books have been written with AI. Probably the most recent one that was in the news was a book that was on Amazon, but it had that tagline, "This book was written in the so-and-so style," which I'm like, oh my gosh, that is so That is so bad. And then going forward to like AI art for book covers and stuff like that, that is also very huge. Now, I think, a lot of us will admit that we have used some form of AI, whether it's like, Grammarly or software or program that helps with the format of our book in terms of like the outlines and possibly for characters. Maybe not. And if that's the case, I completely understand and respect your opinion. But I think that's ultimately we can accept on the fact that AI should be used as a tool. When it comes to writing the story, that's a huge no. But unfortunately, there are books that have been written with AI. So, in your opinion, Bill, how should AI be treated as a tool for an author?
I feel like it should be treated like you're handling cyanide, frankly.
All right.
Legally speaking. Oh, just in the news recently, Disney has jumped into the game going, oh, heck no. You are not. I mean, they're going after Midjourney because they're like, you have shamelessly stolen our work and we're going to sue you for it. And so here's the thing. How far is that going to extend? Because you don't screw with the mouse.
No, you do not.
No. And so if they do get the victory thereafter, that could change the landscape significantly. And so then it becomes a question of how dangerous is it to have any element of AI in your work at that point? But I mean, honestly, I'm very opposed to AI because the whole AI has no life experience.
Right.
None that it hasn't stolen. And the thing that makes a story sing, the reason my Gideon Keep books, for example, are so good and people enjoy them. I mean, really, a lot of the stuff I've done is because it's getting filtered through my life experience.
Right.
You get that with an AI. I don't
No,
care.
you don't.
Anyone wants to give me the crap line about how they feed the stuff into AI and the way they feed it in. I'm sorry. I call bullshit. Utter bullshit. I rarely will be that viciously opposed to something, an approach, and doing something differently within publishing. But this is a case where I am not at all in favor of it. I think it's dangerous. I have my mindset about AI is that it is the same thing as taking a sheet of paper of text and copying it over and over in a copying machine. And you know what you're going to end up with at the end of it? A gray piece of paper that you can't even read.
Mm-hmm. That is very true.
That's my concern with it. There's also a lot of other issues with it. Most of AI is filtering it in a way to where it is favoring a white male voice. That's not good. We don't want that to be all we're getting. Again, that kind of runs counter to what, I mean, we were talking about that golden age Renaissance idea.
Right.
That totally runs against that. And if people are flooding the market with that, honestly, to a degree, I don't want that because then it's like, I already am a white male guy. I don't need people shoving all sorts of crap into the market with my voice.
That is true. That is very, very true, Bill. And you bring up a lot of great points.
So yeah, I generally avoid it. I don't. In fact, the closest I come to AI is spell check in Microsoft Word, and that's it. I don't use anything else. Part of it is I've been writing since high school, and that was back in the 90s. I have spent decades crafting my voice. I've spent decades honing my technique for getting my butt in the chair and getting the words on the page and all the different things I do, which are they super fast? Maybe faster than some, but certainly, yeah, it's more arduous than probably if I was using AI for some of it. But but if I were to do that, I'd be sacrificing part of what I've done to get to this point. And that's, I think people don't understand. It is a cheat, and the cheat is they're cheating themselves. That's what concerns me.
Definitely. And again, you bring up a lot of great points, Bill. And I've talked to a lot of authors on this question. And, this is a very, opinionated question. Some authors I've talked on the show have had the same opinions as you, Bill, that they are staunchly against the use of AI. I've had authors on the show that have used some form of tool, not for writing, but just when it comes to the outlines and characters to help on that end. And, I'll be also the first to admit I've also used something similar for my characters and for my plot and outlines. But that's it. That's the only thing that I use that tool for. Because when it comes to, my stories, I want people to hear my voice as the author. I don't want them to hear someone else's voice because there is going to be a book that already has that voice. I want them to hear my voice. And this actually leads perfectly into the business side of being an author, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on. So as another icebreaker, when you finished writing the first book in the Gidion series, after it was proofread, it was edited, cover artist wrote the cover exactly the way you wanted it, how much research did you really go into to figure out what direction of publication was the best for you?
I had been involved with James River Writers here in Richmond since the first conference we had back in 2003. I wasn't, when my wife and I first attended it then, we were attendees. We were not involved behind the scenes, but the next year we couldn't afford to go, so we volunteered to work with it. And the reason I bring this up is because people talk about, some people go the FML, I don't know what I'm saying, outside, why is my brain shorting? Oh. But people will go to, will do a college class for, whatever. Anyway, so you know what I'm trying to get. People will
right.
James River Writers was my school. That was what I used to get my knowledge of the industry, to get the knowledge of craft. And I will say that, I was diehard about going traditional. I was going to get an agent. I was going to get to the big houses. Haven't done it yet. No. Now, I did traditionally publish the Gidion Keep books. Those were with a small press that I found, but I did not use an agent. Up until that point, though, I will say one of the things I regret deeply, was that during my first decade with James River Writers, leading up to the publication of Gidion,
right,
I went to almost exclusively the craft panels. And I'll down my nose a little bit at the folks who were going to favoring the business panels. Well, come the Gidion Keep books getting published, I was not happy with past Bill. Because I'm like, some of that knowledge would have been really useful, idiot.
Yeah.
So maybe should have been going to some of those panels and not just exclusively to the craft ones, but hindsight. And so, and I will say it's tough to kind of, on the one hand, oh my gosh, the target is constantly moving. I mean, I know you get that too. It's like,
yes,
one year doesn't necessarily work the next in terms of finding readers or publishers. Industry just is evolving so quickly. Even the major publishers have struggled because they are constantly. When the pandemic hit, I think that was part of the thing that kind of blindsided the major publishers at that point, because some of them had made good inroads with ebooks, but there were a lot of them that had not taken as much advantage of it as they should have, and it showed because people weren't able to go out to the bookstore. And getting things shipped was a problem. So the ebook was that it suddenly became this useful, immediate satisfaction thing that people were like, "Oh, this is nice. I can adjust the font size." And I mean, as far as I learned a lot from JRW and getting to work with a lot of those folks. And so even though I didn't go to a lot of those panels that favored the business side of things, I was still at least getting enough exposure to where I could figure out how to adapt to the industry. Part of it was because there were panels I moderated that were focused on the business. One of the first panels I ever moderated for JRW, which was about 3 or 4 years into the conference's life, was on self-publishing.
Right.
Such an immensely different conversation for a panel like that now.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the questions at that point was, what do you do with the books once you've got them printed? That's not an issue now. We have print on demand. That didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah, that again, very true, how the industry has changed over time. And speaking of changing over time, it's the readership and the market target audience, which for all authors, for all of us, that is what we struggle with. Doesn't matter if you're hybrid, doesn't matter if you're indie, doesn't matter if you're traditional. That is the one side of being an author. 9 times out of 10, we're not going to hit the nail on the head. It is not easy. But this has raised another discussion, which I'm eager to hear your thoughts on this, Bill, of whether it's best to market to your target audience or market to your readership. So let's start with like a little beginner question. So when you began planning the Gidion Vampire Hunter series, did you have a good idea of your audience at the time, or did that come about later through trial and error of seeing what people enjoyed about the series?
Honestly, I was very bad about thinking about that kind of thing. There are a lot of things in hindsight I probably should have done differently. One could argue that maybe I did shoot myself in the foot by having a male protagonist in YA. But I also will say there are a lot of people who read the book, and that was part of the thing they loved about it. That it didn't have the YA is dominated by female characters as far as the main characters go, and that is a very complicated issue. Part of that is because they are playing to the audience that's there, and part of the problem is that guys are not good about reading. But there are arguments that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you only put books out there that have women as the main leads in it, that creates the problem. But at the same time, guys should not be limiting themselves to books that just have guys in them. So it's a bit of both. That is a both sides issue, in my opinion.
Yes.
Complicates it. But so yeah, there are things I would do differently, potentially. One of the things I did with the Gidion Keep book is, you were talking about the variety of vampire things earlier.
Correct.
One of the things I did differently with the Gidion Keep books, I wanted a very specific pack structure that would be different. I feel like a lot of times writers have drawn on the same thing that happens with wolf packs to build their vampire covenants. And I'm like, guys, come on, let the wolves have their thing.
Yes.
I went researching for different pack structures, and I came across the pack structure for hyenas. That practically wrote my first book. It was so cool. And part of the thing that was really neat about the hyena world is that in the hyena world, the women rule. And that defined a lot of the structure. A lot of the male hyenas are nomadic. They don't exist within a pack. So that was structured a lot of the things that I did with the vampires in the first Gidion book. Now, where this bit me in the butt, because I wasn't thinking about this when I wrote it.
All right.
I was writing a story that involved 3 generations of male vampire hunters: Gidion, his dad, and his grandfather. I had 3 generations of guys on one side, and I had a matriarchal society on the other. Right. You see where I'm going with this?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That was one of the things. And I will confess, even looking back on that, I'm just like, oh. I mean, and it was a criticism, essentially, in one of the reviews. And you know what? The reviewer was right. I completely agree with them. Like, it was just one of the things, at the time I was just writing it, and I was writing to do something fun and different. And it didn't even occur to me the consequences of that choice. And I think that is probably something I did learn from that experience, to try and think about that a little bit more. I'm still trying to get better about it. Man, I'm editing a book right now, and I caught something I did with one of the characters in it. And I'm just like, oh, why did that not even jump out at me until now? Thank God I caught it before publication, because it's coming out in January. But I was just like, oh, that it was a subtle racist element to describing this character.
Okay.
Put it in there, and I was so mad, because even at the time I was writing, I knew better.
All right. And taking from there, looking back now as you've honed your writing skills and really fine-tune of how you approach your storytelling, Bill, would you consider yourself an author who writes to his target readership or target audience? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, this has been a discussion. Is it best to hit the larger group within the genre that you're trying to write for, or go for the specific readerships because those have the most genuine and thoughtful reactions?
I would be lying if I said I really do write to my audience. The reason I say that is because more often than not, I'm just trying to. The writers I admire the most are constantly trying to do something different in their writing. People like N.K. Jemisin, Melinda Lowe. Melinda Lowe especially is a great example of that. Within young adult, she has written epic fantasy, historical romance, and mystery thriller novel.
Ooh, all right.
She is constantly trying to delve into different waters as an author, and it's part of why I love her work. When I read last night at the Telegraph Club, which was her foray into historical fiction, historical romance. Oh my God, that book! I read it in January of the year it came out. And even then I knew, I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be one of my favorite books of the year. Because it was just so good. And her writing was just that, she's just that good of a writer. And I love the fact that she's willing to take risk with leadership in that way. But there's also a strength to doing that kind of thing that I appreciate in my own writing. I do write exclusively fantasy. But I have a variety of fantasy. I have my Vampire Hunter series.
Right.
I've got my epic fantasy, which is the Cold Shoulder, which is traditional epic fantasy. I've got bizarre horror, sword fighty, dystopian West of Apocalypse, and I've got my Cold War spy thriller that's X-Men meets John le Carre.
Ooh, okay.
Given me is, and I get to take advantage of this now when I go to an event where I'm selling books. I now get to turn things around to where the people coming up to me aren't asking, so what do you have? I go, well, what do you read? Because I have a variety depending on their answer. I can go, I've done this several times very successfully now, where it's like if they say, oh, well, I had one kid who came up to my table at a library event recently, he was like, I like dystopia. And I went, oh, you want West of Apocalypse. That's the book for you. But it's like, depending on their answer, I now have a way to pivot. In fact, that's part of why I did put Cold Shoulder together to release as a novel, because I realized once that was a strength I had, I was missing out on having that traditional epic fantasy novel that I could put out there. I'm like, I've got it written, I've got it out there. I just don't have it assembled in a paperback or an ebook. It was serialized when I released it originally. With Vella, and Kindle Vella was folding anyway. So I was just like, this is stupid not to have it out there. But that is how I approach it now. I think there's a strength some writers can have where they do the same thing consistently again and again and again, kind of the Jane Patterson thing. When you pick up a Patterson book, you know what you're getting, regardless of how you. I mean, I'm not one of his acolytes, but at the same time, I respect that he has built a very solid brand. When you pick up a James Patterson mystery novel, you know what you're getting. There's a comfort in that for some readers. Other readers want to be surprised. They want that variety. They want to get something different. Victoria Schwab is a great example of that too. She does a lot of different types of fantasy. And in fact, the thing I'm releasing next year was even partly inspired by one of her books in terms of how I structured the story. But yeah, I think that is a strength you can have as a writer. So in a way, it's like I'm trusting the readership I have to come along with me based on the skill set I've shown them. And hoping that I will bring in new people with the new thing I do, who may then go back and explore the backlog and find new things they might not have explored otherwise. So
definitely
really answers your question.
Oh, it actually kind of does, because it leads into the follow-up one, which is kind to reiterating what you said, Bill. From how I understood it, it's like it all depends on the author. Some authors, they do target their audience because they feel more comfortable with that, but some want to try something different. They want to target their readership, and they want to write in a style that's familiar to their readers. And that leads to this discussion of balancing our own individuality as authors, while also understanding if we're going into a genre where there are expectations that the reader knows of, we have to understand that and keep that in mind. And I know you've probably heard this at other writers' conferences where they say, write the book that you would have loved to have read growing up. I was a big firm believer of that, still am, but I'm also very aware, writing 3 books and now getting my 4th book hopefully finished and published by the end of this year. I understand that I cannot make something truly original in the sense that it's something that it's never been done before, because that's virtually impossible. The same story has been told numerous times in various genres and subgenres. But even with that said, you can still make it unique and give it a new facelift so that way it's familiar to the readership, but yet not like a hash of George R. Martin, J.K. Rowling, Brian Sanderson, and many other authors. I'll give an example. There was a book that I read from, if I can see it on my shelf, it's right next to me, Stephen Arion, who wrote the duology series, The Warrior and the Coward. I absolutely fell in love with that duology because it turned the hero's journey, probably one of the most basic story plot premises, and turned it on its head. The main character, it's almost like Logan from the movie, where you have this warrior, he's a drifter, and everyone says, like, oh, you are this great person, you're part of this band of heroes, because it plays on the notion of, the songs being sung about this traveling band of heroes who stopped evil. He throws it right in your face, Stephen, that this guy is not some great warrior. He just got lucky. He was the last one to make it out alive. And all the heroes that are mentioned in the fables and stories, songs and legends, they died within the first 2 days of going on this quest. It throws it right in your face that this is not your typical hero's journey. And it deals a lot of major topics like PTSD, anxiety, imposter syndrome, because this man was a child when he joined this band of heroes. He slew the monster, but he was mentally scarred for the rest of his life. And I fervently adored that series. And that's a perfect example of making something that's new, but still being, what's the word I'm thinking of now? Still being familiar to its readers. So for you, Bill, for your books from Dragon Spy, West of Apocalypse, The Cold Shoulder, and the Vampire Hunter series, how have you been able to balance your individuality while also understanding for each of those books, in those respective genres, there are expectations that the readers are anticipating?
Oh, wow. And it's one of those things in terms of, in the end, one of the things I've struggled with, I want to jump back to something you said, because it hits home. That idea of writing the book you would have wanted to read when you were a kid.
Right.
That was the Gideon Keep books for me.
All right.
I've always been fascinated with the Vampire Hunter. I'm fascinated by this guy who is crazy enough to go after this powerful monster to try and take it down, even though they are not as powerful as it on the surface. And that was always very neat to me. With that in mind, what we run into, though, is if you're going to do if you really want to be an author, you're going to hit a point at which you're going, okay, I wrote that. Now what?
Yes.
And that was where I kind of ended up with the Gideon. After I got done with Gideon, I was kind of floundering a little bit, trying to figure out, where do I go from here? What do I want to write? And as far as meeting the expectations, I think it became more of trying to figure out, what is something I can pitch to a potential agent or publisher, and get them to go, that sounds like something I'd want to read.
Yes.
And so I probably spent a lot of time, even leading up to Gideon, I was working on it, but it was just trying to figure out, how do you pitch something? And I've gotten a lot better at it through trial and error, making a lot of mistakes. But yeah, it's like, for example, I mentioned the pitch for the Dragon Spy earlier. That is essentially I ended up writing X-Men meets Cold War spy thriller of Tom Clancy, John le Carre. That was what I wanted to do with that book. And it's one of those things when people hear it, they go, oh, that's the thing. If you can get that idea of I think it's less about the story. I think as long as your pitch can satisfy the reader, the book can satisfy the pitch you're giving the reader, that makes the difference. One of the things I'm struggling with right now is the book I am currently writing, which I really can't say a lot about it yet because I'm still,
of course.
I'm only about a little more than a halfway through it kind of point here. And I'm struggling on how I'm going to pitch it because there's a huge, huge twist about 3/4 of the way through it that I'm going to drop on the reader. And I'm like, I have to find a way to pitch that story.
Mm-hmm.
The twist.
Right.
And that's going to be tricky. West of Apocalypse, I didn't really have much of an issue with that in terms of trying, because there's a big twist in that story too. But it was just more for me. I've also learned that in terms of pitching that story, I don't pitch the story half as much as I pitch, and I do this with everything now. I pitch why the story matters to me, why I wrote it.
Right.
About meeting expectations. I think one of the things that really connects with readers when you get to talk to them one-on-one, you're right about the fact that there's nothing new under the sun to draw.
Correct.
And so that's the thing. No matter anything I can condense down into a pitch that short is typically not going to be original by itself.
Nope.
So I lean into the emotion of this is why I wrote this. This is why I needed to write it. And this is why I love it now that it's out there in the world. West of Apocalypse was the passion project that snuck up on me. And it was this wild, creative experience. I've said it many times, and it's true. Writing West of Apocalypse was like creative heroin because I got a high writing that book. And I will be chasing that high the rest of my life. That's why it's my favorite book. I know it's usually politic to say that your next book is the book, the new book is the one that's your favorite. I've written several things since West of Apocalypse. It's still my favorite. Aileen Tor, the main character in the back, she is my baby. I love her so much. And I love the adventure. And it's because for me, it was that level up moment as an author. But that's the thing. When I get to talk about this, I am not making this crap up. I am sincerely sharing with the potential reader, this is why I love this book. This is fun writing it. That sells my books more than anything else. And the reasons it works is because it's true. I can't say that about all my other books. They are special to me. Dragon Spy was special to me. Oh my God, that was the one that was... And in fact, I tell people, West of Apocalypse might be my favorite book that I've written, but Dragon Spy is the one I'm the most proud of.
Right.
Because it was the most challenging thing to write. Threading that needle of combining X-Men with John le Carre in 1983, no less, that was one of the... It about broke me trying to write that. And I was so happy when it finally got out there. And readers were connecting with it, and it was landing exactly the way I'd always hoped it would. That was such a relief. And it was exciting because now I'm like, okay, now I got to do the other two books. Talk about pressure. Oh, crap.
Yes. And I 100% agree. I have that same mindset for Michael, which was my first delve into the fantasy genre. I want to make something that was different. So you can say it's like religious fantasy because it deals with a lot of religious figures, angels, demons, but it's a lot of mythology, a lot of world building. And that was one thing people said too, which is the world building was just like the tip of the iceberg. They are intrigued, but they want to know what this world looks like. So I enjoyed writing Michael, but the book that I'm most proud of to finish is my, not Decimus, but it's my World War II story, which that's completely out of my comfort zone because I have never written a true World War II epic. And I don't want to spoil it because I want to keep it until I can get a real good sales pitch so I can share it with everybody. And on this topic of sales pitch, this kind of leads into the notion of, really understanding the business side of being an author and, learning the tips and tricks of the trade. And that, of course, comes with networking and building a crew of people to really help you grow and to also help them grow as well. So for you, Bill, there's a two-part question. How essential is it for an author to really begin networking? And are there any people you would like to give a personal shout out to who have helped you along the way?
Oh God, yeah. To all of that, I got to go back to James River Writers for this.
Mhm.
The writing group I talked about that my wife and I were in, those were people that we met through JRW at the very first conference, in fact. It was the second year where we first started really talking to them, though, and we ended up doing the writing group. Shauna Christos, Catherine Herndon. Catherine is actually the executive director for James River Writers now, by the way.
Okay.
She has been for a decade now, more than, in fact. That she's the lighthouse keeper. People do not understand how important she has been to the writing community here in Richmond. But it would not be as great as it is without her. She has been so important. She's one of my beta readers, even now that we're not in that group anymore. When I have a book that's finished, she's my first go-to a lot of times, and she can be brutal. Oh my gosh, God bless her. And she's a great writer too. Oh my God, she's so good. And she's finishing up a rom-com, fantasy rom-com, and oh man, the idea is so good. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to, but because she's getting ready to hopefully be at the point where she can start pitching agents. My cover artist, also a friend I met through James River Writers, Phil Hilliker, who is also a writer. And
right.
He has taught me a lot about cover art. In fact, one of the best compliments I've gotten from him was the book I have coming out in January, because when I told him my concept for the cover, he was like, he could tell even in the 2 years since West of Apocalypse came out that he did the cover for, and the cover for Dragon Spy that came out last year to now, he was like, I can tell you started to get some of this now. Because it was like, the idea was, a good cover is going to give an idea to the reader of what they're about to get into. And there are little
Absolutely.
things, even just the font selection makes a difference. And Phil really opened up my eyes on that one. But yeah, I've met so many people through that organization. And that, more than anything else, is how I was able to get published.
Mm-hmm.
I was fortunate that I met them early on in my writing journey, because doing that writer group, that elevated my writing. My wife, Sherry, gets a lot of credit for that. And I say that not just because she was the one who insisted we go to the conference, but also Sherry and I wrote a manuscript together many years ago. One day we're going to go back and revisit that and polish it up to get it publishable. But let me tell you, if you really want to challenge your marriage and you really want to up your writing, write with your spouse. The way we did it was that each of us had immediate reading power.
Right.
If it was a scene that only had my characters in it, I could write it, but then she would get to read it and she could clean it up, or she could be like, yeah, that doesn't work. And there were some chapters where it was like, oh my God, I wrote like about 6 different versions of that chapter to finally get past the veto power. And it was, but at the same time, Sherry is so good at how she describes things. And I wish I had the command of language that Sherry had. I probably have upped my game a lot since then, but at the same time, she was a good reader growing up. I was not.
Right. And also, speaking of writers groups, as I mentioned before, viewers and listeners, Bill and I are also authors with Audiomaze, which, if you've been following the social media, it is a new platform for authors, editors, narrators, and creatives. And hopefully when the interview was out a while ago, Bill was actually on the other podcast, which I run, Into the Maze, where Bill talked about his upcoming story, which is another vampire story for Audiomaze. So I just want to make a little plug for that. But on this topic of, growing and connecting with authors and fellow creatives, Bill, I remember I asked you this question, but just to reiterate, what was it like getting that call to really, pitch for Audiomaze and, joining this collaborative network, which is truly it's a diamond in this rough sea of, the publishing world.
I will say that once they accepted the pitch I gave them for my story, oh my God, you talk about the writer, the imposter syndrome kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I started trying to write that story, this idea of trying to write a story that has multiple paths for the listener to go down.
Right.
Oh my gosh, I had to completely rethink the way I approach writing the story because of that. And it was nice to have folks like you and Colton kind of lean on a little bit in our weekly meetings to where I could be like, all right, kind of listen to even some of the things you were just saying about your own projects and how you were approaching them. And also find a way to marry that with my own process. And once I got going, it was great. And it was so fun. I think for me, it was interesting to be able to write a story for once where it's written directly for audio and it's not for a print version.
Right.
And just kind of, in some ways it was freeing, but it took a while to get to that point. I don't know if that did you kind of have a similar reaction to that?
I was a little opposite because, I've never written anything that was, branching. Also, it was a more smaller version in terms of, story and scope. I tend to go very big with my stories, very grand, and that also includes, the word count as well. So it was a learning experience for me, but ultimately being a part of a group of people that, absolutely are passionate about their craft, truly want others to succeed and grow is just honestly incredible.
It's been fun watching how there's so many different right brain, left brain approaches within our group. That's been like, I know I'm very much like, I did, after I wrote like the first couple of chapters, I was immediately like, all right, so this is where I'm averaging on my word count. And so like I was plotting out going, okay, so if I'm averaging about 1,000 words per chapter, I really don't want to go past 24 chapters.
Yes.
So it's like I mapped it out using that approach. And then I can't remember if it was you or someone else said they had like 47 chapters, and I'm like,
that was me.
Oh, how?
It was still a learning experience for me, which hopefully going forward with my next stories, I can do better because I do have some stories in the works. One, hopefully it'll be for next year. And I don't mind sharing this because I think hopefully it will get accepted. But it's Jurassic Park meets Hidalgo meets Fast and the Furious, called Fast and the Fossilized.
Oh, dude. Oh, God.
Yes, so it's just a pitch that I've written, but I am really happy with it, especially now getting a better idea of it and really understanding, Audiomaze as an industry and the types of stories. I'm in a better place with Audiomaze with storytelling and finding my voice in that while also having my own voice in my own stories. And I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And this discussion of, learning new things and growing in the industry leads to our final question, Bill, which is a very loaded one. So just brace yourself. So
okay.
I've been doing this show, The Wandering Scribe, for about 6 going on 7 years. And in total, out of 375 episodes, I've interviewed a total of 100 plus authors, which has indie, hybrid, traditional, aspiring writers, debuting writers, comic writers. I have interviewed a few editors. I've interviewed narrators, Sophia included. She was the first, and many other people. And I've learned a lot from them. And one of the things I've learned, which probably this may interrupt you, or maybe did not know of at the time, which is, as authors, there are 2 paths for us, and we don't even know it. It is to be an author and to be known as an author. One is dedicated to the craft, the other is dedicated to the business. And they both lead to the same goal, but I definitely fervently believe that the second path is the most enticing to new writers who want to get into this industry. And I'm going to say this first and foremost, and Bill, you probably definitely agree with me, is that this is not an industry that's a get-rich-quick scheme. It is not. It is very brutal. It is, a grind. And the harsh truth, the very harsh reality, is that there is no guarantee your first book is going to be an overnight success, or your series is going to be a financial success. Are there exceptions to that? Absolutely. There's one author I had on the show a year ago, Andy Peliquin. His series, which is his love letter to the Witcher video games, it blew up his career. It launched his status as a writer and as an author, and that was incredible. But again, that's not going to be the same case for everybody. And that could be very difficult to really understand. So here's the scenario, Bill. Let's say you're at a writer's conference and you are hosting a seminar that's discussing this topic. And in that seminar, there's a bunch of new writers. Some are in the process of being published. Some are just starting out and just getting into this industry. How would you teach them this idea that in this industry, there's a 50-50 chance that you're going to be successful? But regardless of the outcome, you should not see it as a negative and see it as a learning curve. And also, most importantly, reevaluate your goals so that way they are realistic enough that you can achieve them and also build upon them to really get your name out there. Because we talked about, in the beginning, your 5th book, your 10th book, whatever book that gets your name out there, it will happen. It's just going to take a lot of time and dedication and really understanding this idea. Are you an author just writing books for fun, or are you an author writing books because you want to make this a career and treat it as a job?
I think one of those things, and this kind of goes back to that whole thing about paying attention to the business side of things.
Mm-hmm.
As much as I hate to say it, craft doesn't sell books. I hate that. I feel like it should. Let me revisit that a little bit. Okay, let me reword that somewhat. Here's the thing. Craft alone is not going to sell your first book to a person or the first book they get from you.
Right.
Craft will get them to trust you for the next book. That's the thing. You're not good. You got to know enough about how to sell that book to your first time reader. But if you're going to hold on to them and get them to buy another book from you, you have to deliver the craft. It's that whole thing about what you were talking about earlier too. You've got to be able to deliver on the promises that you make in that story when you open it. There's a promise made to the reader, even in the jacket of the book. There's a promise made of what's going to be inside. And in fact, you do many readers who get ticked off, even if a book's well written, that what was advertised does not match up with what's in the book. And you can still lose a reader with that. And so it's like there's that craft. It's not just a craft in terms of being able to write the book well. It's a craft in terms of knowing how to pitch it well. And being able to, there are a lot of people who need to get their skins very thick to survive this, because you have to understand you're never going to write that book that everyone's going to want to read.
Right.
Your book is not, no book is intended for everybody. Not everyone Bible. And how many people have copies of it?
Yes.
I mean, it's just not every book's going to satisfy every reader. Get rid of that expectation. The trick is to learn how to find the reader you want and be interested in what you've written.
That is probably some of the best advice I've gotten on this question, Bill, especially where you've said craft doesn't sell your books, craft gains the trust of your reader, which I have not really considered that, because it is very true. Yeah. When you make that sales pitch to your reader for your first book, they're trusting that you're going to uphold your promise. And if you do, now comes the hard part. How are you going to keep them hooked for the long ride for all of your stories, and possibly different ones too, which ultimately is some of the best advice I've ever gotten on this question, Bill. So thank you for that. And as a sort of a fun little question, I don't ask this a lot, but I think it is important. It's this. Looking back on your career thus far, Bill, from its highs and its lows, how different would your life be if you did not pursue this career of being an author? And with everything you've learned from the highs and lows of being an author, what are your words of wisdom to the fellow writers and fellow authors watching or listening to this interview right now?
I mean, honestly, I can't conceive of not being an author. Fine. I just, it's kind of, I sometimes call it this beautiful arrogance. I feel like I have these stories in my head, and they're so cool, and I love them so much that I think they should be in other people's heads. And I have felt like that the vast majority of my life.
Mm.
And so that's why I'm like, I can't reasonably conceive of not being an author. The whole reason I went indie with West of Apocalypse was because I told you earlier about how special that writing experience was.
Absolutely.
I finished that book in the summer of 2018. It did not come out until the fall of 2023. That was a very painful 6 years. Sucked. And it just, oh man, it was such a relief to finally have it out there. It feels silly getting emotional about a book that on the surface is simply a epic fantasy quest for revenge for this character. But it was a book that was so special for me because it was where my craft leveled up. It was where I got to do so many cool things I never thought I was capable of as an author. And and out there, not being able to talk about it. It was one of the worst things I could imagine dealing with. And I know I'm completely forgetting the second part of the question at this point.
That's okay, Bill. That's okay.
But, yeah, I mean, that was, as far as the advice goes, oh, wow, there's so many things. It's two things. Read a lot, read widely. You can't just read within the market and the genre you're going to write in, because if you do, you're only going to ever be an echo. And you need to be the part of what made my Gidion Keep books work was because I also read a lot of mystery.
Right.
And I fed that into those books. I also read a lot of nonfiction. And that helped because it helped me cultivate my voice. And it gave me knowledge that I was able to apply to the reality. Things like the way I built the vampires. I treated them like the serial killers of old in the U.S. Mindhunters, which got adapted into a Netflix series. I used a lot of elements from that book for my vampires because they're essentially serial killers.
All right.
So yeah, that's one thing. The other thing, if you're getting started on the journey and you needed to cultivate your voice in a hurry, short stories. I regret how long I waited to do it, but you gain something as an author when you get to the end of a story. And it's so hard to do that with a novel, and it takes so long. Whereas if you do it with a short story, you get to start getting to that finish line faster. And every time you get to the finish line, you get to look back and be like, okay, well, that didn't work. And so that the next time you go to write a story and you can be like, oh, that's the same issue I ran before, so I need to do this instead.
Right.
Up the learning curve. And I resisted that for a very long time. And while I'm happy about where I am in my journey, that is one of the few regrets I have.
Absolutely. Very good piece of advice, Bill. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude an amazing author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. A huge thank you to my friend Bill for coming on the show. We wish him the very best with his series and any future works he has in the making, as well as his eventual release of his vampire story for Audiomaze, which everything goes according to plan. It should be out later this year, so make sure to follow him and Audiomaze on social media. And speaking of social media, Bill, where can people find you to stay up to date with any projects or any conventions you're going to be at? And where can people buy copies of your books?
Go to billblume.net. That's my website. I've got links to my social media from there. I'm most active on Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky these days. Threads especially, but yeah, that's mostly it.
Awesome. I'll link all those down below in the description of this video. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for another amazing interview. A huge thank you to Bill for coming on the show. Hopefully this won't be the last time we see him. Hopefully I can get him back for a follow-up interview for another story in the works. So make sure to follow both of us on our respective social media, as well as like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date for future episodes and future posts. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you all in the next episode.